Time.
Okay, it's 11 o'clock here in Buenos Aires and 15 hours at Copenhagen. We're going to start. Alejandro, I'm going to admit everyone.
Todas las noches. Yo también, o sea, es como que, a excepción de lo que es proteína, o sea, eso lo hago.
Mutea, por favor, tu charla. Ya. Ready. Good morning, good afternoon for everyone. My name is Alejandro Esteves, and I am a professor of the University of Buenos Aires, and also I'm the director of the CDO, Center of Study of the State and Public of Organization in the Faculty of Science, Economic Science of the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina. This is the first webinar of Public Policy in Context. The purpose of those webinars is to show us the current debate between the main public policy experts of developed countries in relation to crisis, governance, policy learning, public policy agenda, narratives, new actors, and any other issues that emerge in this cycle of conferences. This is a free, non-profit, and academic event organized by the Argentinian non-governmental organization, Espacios Political Spaces translated, and the CAGG, Center for Advocacy and Global Growth. It is a pleasure for me and for us to introduce EVA SORENSEN, who will speak us in this first meeting of crisis events and public sector governance. We also have the presence of Professor Maximiliano Campos Rios, from the University of Buenos Aires, who is a specialist in public administration and completed a postgraduate study in the University of Delaware with Fulbright course and Georgetown University, both at the United States. And he will be the one who will comment at the end of Eva's presentation. But let me introduce our today's speaker. Eva Sorensen has a Master in Political Science and a PhD and DSc in Public Administration in the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. She has a vast academic career, and her current and most recent positions held are professor in the Roskilde School of Governance, Roskilde or Roskilde, as you want, professor in the University North 2040, professor in Public Administration and Democracy in the Institute of Society and Globalization, Roskilde University since 2003. In relation to her guest scholarship and academic awards, she was guest scholar at the Department of Political Science in University of California, Berkeley, 2015 and 2016. Guest professor at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Guest professor at Nagoya University in Japan, and both of them in 2014. Best article, she was awarded with the best article in American Review of Public Administration in 2011. Her scientific focus are political leadership in the age of governance, policy innovation, citizen involvement and co-creation in local neighborhood governance, meta-governance, and network governance, institutional developments in representative democracy, changing role perceptions among citizens, professionals, politicians, and public administration. We could go on and on about Eva's resume for a long time, but we think we should let her talk about her webinar of today. Eva presentations will last approximately 40-50 minutes. Then we will have some comments from Professor Campos Rios, and the audience will be able to ask some questions after the conference. No, please, Eva, for me it's a pleasure. You can start.
Thank you so much, Alessandro, for the very kind presentation for all the different things I've been doing. And I'm really so glad to be invited to give a talk in your important institution, and to have a chance to talk about a topic that I'm really interested in, and I think is really crucial importance right now. I will immediately go to sharing my slides. I hope it will work. Let's see, share screen. Here we go. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Good.
Yes,
and what I really want to talk about with you is, of course, about these very, very difficult times that we're in, and what that implies for public governance, and the way we as researchers try to understand what is going on. And the title that we've been agreed on is to look at crisis events and public sector governance. And I don't have to list all the crises that we're in currently, but how can public governance actually respond to these different crises? And I must say, I wanted to start by giving a quote from Francis Fukuyama, the really well-known political scientist, who actually at some point, it's a book already from 2008, saying we are better at coping with the many likely challenges with small consequences than with the unlikely events with enormous consequences. And I think that's really, there he captures a characteristic of public administration and governance research. We tend to focus on all the similarities and how we should. There's a sound. Is somebody saying anything? Okay, I'll continue. Okay, that actually we spent a lot of time in our research trying to understand the regularity rather than also dealing with how do we actually how do we respond to all these sudden events that are taking place. And of course, there is some research looking at that. And we call it exactly talk about it as crisis governance and so on. There is a emerging literature focusing on what we call disaster management, you know, like these, how can we occasionally respond to rare events? This is what, and in most public sectors, you have a particular kind of sector or organization for dealing with these kinds of trouble. But the rest of the time we are, you know, kind of organizing things as if it were, you know, kind of regularity, and this is going to happen every day and so on and so forth, you know, like more routine matters. And over time, as we have actually recognized that these kinds of disturbances are more than rare occasions, they are actually happening at a more regularity, we have begun to talk about the concept of resilience. You know, that we actually need some more systemic resilience in the public sector and in governance processes and so on. And systemic resilience is kind of defined as an ability to bounce back if something is disturbed, so we can get back to normality, back to an equilibrium situation where things are balanced and so on and so forth. But in recent years, and I and my colleagues have actually taken very active part in trying to say that resilience doesn't really, it's actually not really the tool we need in research to understand how to respond to these kinds of changes. We are talking about turbulence as a normality. This is basically what we are focusing at. We are saying today, and also early on, but particularly today, turbulence is kind of the everyday normality of what public institutions experience. And therefore, we have to do much more than bounce back now and then. We have to build an institutional and operational capacity, what we call robustness, into the public governance system, that we actually have, that are everything we do in governance institutions. We have to take the starting point that we don't know what's going to come in a second. And that's a quite different approach to saying, yeah, the capacity we need to build is a capacity to deal with the unknown, actually, through adaptation, to the ability of adapting to what will come, and also to innovate what we're doing to meet the emerging. And we define turbulence in our research that we're doing now as situations where events, demands interact in highly variable, inconsistent, unexpected, and really unpredictable manner. So we can just as well give up the idea that we can see what will come and instead concentrate on being ready for whatever may come. So turbulence exists when the events and demands that an organization face are non-trivial and discontinuous and tend to render, and that's important, pre-prepared solutions irrelevant, ineffective, and also illegitimate. So simply all the things all the processes, all the tools we have on the shelf tend to suddenly become irrelevant. And I think we can look at some examples of that. I'll do that in a second. And what is it that drives the turbulence? And why is it that we see more turbulence now than we ever did before? And I think it is because of the speed of social interaction is actually, becoming stronger and stronger. The complexity in the things that we aim to govern are becoming larger and larger. And also the conflicts that are involved in governance process are really intense and becoming even more intense. And both all these kind of the speed, the complexity, the conflict comes both from outside the public sector in society. It also comes from inside the public sector itself. And it also comes between levels of governance, kind of regional and national levels and international, transnational levels of governance that affect national government, for example. What we're trying to stress can you also hear some sounds?
Yes, go ahead, Eva.
Okay.
Go ahead. Don't worry.
What we're trying to stress in our research is also that turbulence is different than crisis, the concept of crisis. Because a crisis is a specific threatening event that creates uncertainty and calls for urgent, extraordinary action, as I was saying. And although turbulence may threaten basic structures, actually you can imagine that we could build an organization that actually regarded turbulence as normal. And that's the whole thing. And we need to build an organization that views turbulence as normal. And actually, when we don't see that all the turbulence, it's mainly because we have closed our eyes and said, well, probably it's going to be the same tomorrow as it is today. And therefore but we have to see turbulence and approach turbulence as something that is normal so we can ready ourselves for it. And I would say that crisis is often something that a product of the failure to be ready for turbulence. Sometimes you see the financial crisis or whatever, that actually the reason why it becomes a crisis is because we haven't dealt with the turbulence that started the whole thing early on, and it's the same with climate chaos. When we begin to see the first signs of these things, were we ready to react or weren't we? And it becomes a crisis when we don't react early enough to try to deal with what is emerging and so on. And also I should point out that calling turbulence a crisis, the second where we begin to call turbulence a crisis, it's actually kind of a political action. It's the way of kind of legitimizing radical exceptional action, right? So you can see in different phases of the Corona crisis that actually at some points people are talking about, oh, well, it's just like a flu. This is kind of avoiding talking about it as a crisis. But in the second you begin to talk about it as a really life-threatening thing, you begin to talk about it as a crisis, and therefore you have free map to declare state emergency and whatever. So it's actually a very also political thing to decide whether you will talk about something as a crisis or not. What it is basically a turbulence that we can react to in different ways. And just as I said, why is it, what we can see today is that the concept of crisis management is completely insufficient as a means for government to respond to current turbulence, because the turbulence is so massive. The speed of digitalization and other technological and scientific achievements, that actually rock the boat all the time, change the way people live. And I think that's really the key to understanding turbulence, that if some changes don't make all that much difference, but if changes really affect the normality of people's lives, then it calls for governance action, no doubt about it. And many of the changes we see to have directly impact on the way people live. So many of these technical developments have that impact. And also, of course, the pandemic, climate change, migration, all the gender and race conflicts that we're facing in many countries, and so on. And these conflicts are not going to go away anytime soon. What is even more is that all of these changes are interconnected. Like if something happens technical happens, it might have some impact actually on migration or whatever, or pandemics and climate change, that there's a spillover effect, and that makes things even more unpredictable. And the failure I think we have actually experienced a great failure to respond to the fact that that public governance takes place in a really turbulent world where we don't know what to expect tomorrow and how to act tomorrow. And of course, we have tried to develop strategies for that earlier on in the public governance research. We had a long period, I think in the 90s, where we really focused on foresight. Can't we actually try to guess, see what would look at statistics and so on and make guesses about the future, predict what is going to happen. We also had a period where we really looking at protection, like insurance systems, for example. All these insurance systems, they kind of, what is it that we're going to make an insurance against? You have to be able to foresee what it is that's going to come to insure yourself against something. And then again, resilience, what's the limits of that? That is building capacity to reestablish what was. But the fact is, and just let me illustrate with Corona again, all of these strategies, they failed in 2020 when Corona came. We didn't see it coming. And the Danish health authorities, just 2 weeks before we were really hit hard by Corona, our health authorities, the best of experts, said it's not going to come to Denmark, right? And then when it came, we didn't know how to protect ourselves because we didn't know how contagious it was and in what way it was actually contagious and so on. So in the beginning, we had no idea how to protect ourselves against it. And finally, bouncing back, as resilience strategy suggests, is really not desirable. We have to go a new way, not to be better ready for the next pandemic. Everybody's saying there's going to be a new pandemic. How do we prepare ourselves to be ready for that next time? We don't want to bounce back to our ignorance. We want simply to be better ready next time than we are now. And therefore we need to build what we call robustness, because we think the strategy that we actually need to develop is what we call governance robustness, which in the literature, some call also dynamic resilience. So it is kind of elements are in the resilience literature, but we want to stress that it is different from resilience because it is about adapting, it's about innovating, it's about moving forward instead of looking back. And we have looked to natural sciences and different disciplines, both biology, engineering, statistics, and so on. And in that research, robustness refers to a systemic capacity to respond to stress, irregularity, and unpredictability. So that's exactly where we are. And over the last 5 years or so, social sciences have actually become much more interested in exactly that. How can we actually be better in governance to deal with stress, irregularity, and unpredictability? So we define a robust system, or we could say that a robust system is able to govern effectively and legitimately in a dynamic world through adaptation and creative innovation or exploitation of the emerging, what is going to come. So here is a definition. A strategic effort, robust governance is a strategic effort on the part of those who govern to build a capacity into the political the governance system to uphold or realize public agendas, function, or values in the face of all kinds of turbulent events, simply, right? And what is key here? Also, we call it in our writings, we call it also dynamic conservatism. We're talking about dynamic conservatism because you can see we change to be able to do the same, to continue to do the same, and that same is actually governing the public governance. That is to pursue some public agendas, to do the functions that governments need to, that is to promote collective decision-making, and also, for example, to protect certain values, which could, for example, be democracy and so on. So we want to do the same, but to do the same, we need to change the way we do it because the context kind of changes. This is kind of what a robust governance needs to do and aims to do, you can say. So how do we build robust governance? That's, of course, the big question that we're struggling with now. And what we're saying is that Yeah, it's both a political and an administrative and a scientific capacity we need to develop. And you both have to have it, or the way you get it, it's a property both of the institution, the governance institution. You need to develop institutions that are robust. You also need to develop governance processes that are robust. And you also need to have robust governance tools. And what are they? Let me just say a few words about each of these kinds of properties of institutions, processes, and policies. About institutions. They are designed, to get that kind of being able to do the same in new ways when it's necessary. That calls for institutions that are not kind of fixed and, completely rock solid. It's more important to have institutions that are designed to accommodate a flexible restructuring of a governance process and the tools that we select to try to govern in light of what is coming. And what we call these kinds of institutions are platforms, different kinds of platforms, arrangements that are places where something can happen. We have it, of course, in digital communication, where we talk about digital platforms, but you can also imagine physical platforms, right? That actually, just a really brief example is a city here in Copenhagen, in Denmark, where they've actually built a house. They built a house with a structure within it that can facilitate governance, but it's open to any form of governance. It's a place where you have the facilities to bring actors together to try to respond and to deal with upcoming governance problems. That's what we call a platform. You also have kind of digital platforms, as we have one that's called Nextdoor. It's a kind of platform that you develop for a neighborhood, but the only thing you have there is a communication structure, and the people who live in that particular neighborhood, they can use it for whatever purpose they want when it comes up. What is it that is really important for our neighborhood now? And then they can use it as a kind of platform for discussing all this. So this is for us a robust institution. And also that you have procedures you build before bad things happen or change happens. You have to develop procedures for fast-track mobilization of those actors who actually need to be mobilized to respond to a certain thing. So you can't point out who those actors are before the event has happened, because you don't know what will happen and what actors would be important. But you can prepare the procedures for bringing actors together. For example, when we had to respond to COVID again, who suddenly COVID happens, and then if we've had some stronger procedures for actually mobilizing health personnel and so on, we could have done much more. Finally, incentive structures is also part of institutions. Make sure that public actors have the incentives to actually act promptly and quickly and with force, so that you can already put that into the structure early on, before things happen. If you look at robust governance processes, I think what you could say about them is that they involve actors with insights, ideas, perspectives, and capacities, also capacities to block action. Then you need to involve all those who can impinge or affect our ability to respond to an emerging problem. So this is also a kind of ability to establish the right networks at the right time, exactly, with actors who actually have the necessary knowledge. And we don't know what the necessary knowledge will be until we are there. We don't know who would be the one to set up resistance if we don't involve them. So involve them immediately and with speed when things happen. And what we're saying here is basically that it requires collaborative governance structures to kind of get that going. But it also, and that's some of my newer research, is a particular form of leadership, both public administrative and political leadership, to kind of look at my leadership is to mobilize the right actors at the right time. So I will build capacity, leadership capacity for myself to be able to, and also network relations that makes it possible for me to actually mobilize the right actors at the right time and bring them together in a collaboration. Let me say a few things about political leadership and that kind of political leadership. I have my recent book here. I also have it in the corner here, which I define as a strategic effort to engage relevant and affected members of a political community in the formulation and implementation of political vision, strategies, and policy solutions. So it's simply, how can we, if we are going to respond to something that comes up, the war in Ukraine or whatever, how can we actually how can we be ready to bring in the right people from our society in Denmark and use them and engage them in the formulation and implementation of a vision for our response, but also our strategies and the way we like to work with these things. Let me just give you a colorful example of the difference between an interactive leadership approach that I would say our Prime Minister actually carried out in the beginning of the corona, and then our, the guy called Trump, who had each their reaction to COVID. And I would say a traditional political leadership approach is actually close to what he did. He said, I'm in the top of the system, I'm in control. I know what to do. The solution is simple to COVID, to the China virus, as he said. Those who disagree are enemies of the people. Experts, the system cannot be trusted. I alone can make it happen. This is the kind of sovereign, capable, monolithic leader of the old time, I would say, which prevents, I would say it is anti-robust. It's an anti-robust form of leadership because it cannot, basically no one can respond to the unknown, the unpredictable that way. Because the thing about unpredictability is that you don't know what is coming and you don't have any tools and you don't know how to respond. You have to work with it as it emerges. And that is exactly what Fredrickson did, what I call interactive political leadership. She said, called a press conference, we don't have a ready-made plan for this. I will make a lot of mistakes. This is enormously complex and difficult to find the right strategy to respond to COVID. I need a lot of input from experts and from everybody. And we will negotiate a broadly supported solution. And we will fight this together, which is the kind of we creating. We have the capacity. We can do it together. We can not do it. Any of us can do it, not do it alone, which is a kind of leadership strategy that really is much more robust because you can see what happens there is that everybody learns along the way. Everybody finds a maybe imperfect, but kind of broadly supported solution that can actually mobilize support and action and give some direction. Let me just then say finally a bit about robust governance tools, or what you can also see, a policy, the content of what we are doing can also be more or less robust. For example, if you make policies that are really rigid and hard to change, then they would be a problem if something comes up that you had not foreseen. This is basically the problem, right? So we have looked at all kinds of literatures and so on, and again, tried to apply them to COVID. And we have listed here in a recent article, these 6 kind of robust strategies or tools, policy tools. In any policy, you should build in scalability. This is the first one, that you can scale up something or diminish something in response to what is happening. Because you don't want to have a scaled up readiness to something that is not going to happen. Rather, you should have readiness to be able to scale up if it happens, right? In Denmark, an example is very much, will it snow or will it not snow? Should we have 50 snow machines that can remove snow from the streets when it happens, and then have them standing 5 years in a row not taken into use because it doesn't snow? Or should you actually have machines that could actually be changed to something else so that we can use them for something else when it's not snowing? And in Corona, we actually saw this about, for example, a system where you actually ready, for example, retires health personnel to step back into service when need be. Then it's kind of a buffer you can use, but you can ready. We did that in Denmark in Corona, but we weren't ready for it, so it took a long time. We should actually have a system already in the beginning to an agreement with retired people about when they could come in and how they could contribute. Also, prototyping is a second kind of strategy. This kind of let us develop something as we go, see if it works, innovate and change it when we learn that it somewhat works, but not completely. And I think that is exactly what we did again in Denmark, at least with degrees and forms of lockdowns. We started out with, making a complete lockdown, and then we learned that we could also make much more targeted lockdowns in specific areas of the countries and so on. So we kind of tried it and said, what is the result if we only lock down this? Oh, it actually kind of helped. So we don't have to lock everything down every time and so on. Third, modularization. That is actually you develop a policy as a form of disconnected modules that you can collect and connect in different ways when need be. And I think also we saw there that we had on the shelf, we had these modules. One was a testing module, one was a tracking module, one was a quarantining module, and one was a mask module. And then we tried to combine them in different ways, in different situations to see what worked best. And decentered actors could actually had the freedom to try to mix these things in different combinations. And that's the next one for accountable autonomy. That if you don't have some local autonomy out there, then you get a very stiff system. But if you have some guidelines about how can local actors translate and adapt and so on, overall guidelines to how we should respond. We had that, for example, when we had to open schools again in a safe way. We actually said you have to make sure of this, this, and this, but how to do it is actually in the end you will be the best to actually find the way to make the most safe strategy in your particular school because you know the locality. 5, bricolage, using known tools for new purposes. Like you take some normally we do that, let's try to use that on this new thing and see if it can actually contribute. You saw examples of using existing medicines to treat Corona while we waited to develop other kinds of new treatment systems. And finally, we call it strategic provenance. That is actually that you build simply organizations, but also production structures and so on that can be restructured to do something else. We also have it with flats, buildings, that increasingly, instead of having a one-person building, purpose building, we are building, houses where you can move the walls around. When you see a tendency to families become bigger or they become smaller, you don't have to tear down the building, you can move around the walls. And the same we saw with Corona. You saw actually kitchenware factories were really quickly reorganized to produce protection equipment, which because we lacked all that protection equipment, then we actually, our production facilities, we actually changed them so they could do something else. But what if we, when we build factories, think that from the starting point, we have to organize it so that it's easy to do. So these are all examples of what I would call robust policy tools that we should think into the policies that we actually make. And then my final thing is really to say that Jakob Torfing and I, we made an analysis of a Danish case of urban governance that was so robust. And it's an old case. And the reason why we began to study it is that just after the Second World War, a network of actors, they thought, how can we make a long-term lasting plan for the development of the Copenhagen metropolitan area? And they developed this idea that it should develop into a hand, as you can see, that you have people live in all the fingers, and in between you want green areas. And every finger is also infrastructure, you know, train rails and shopping malls and whatever. And the amazing thing is that they've made a plan who is adaptable, but still basically can be maintained while it's adapted. Because some of the fingers grew much longer than the intended plan was, but it didn't matter, it didn't ruin the plan. One finger didn't grow out at all, and so on and so forth. And one finger just became half, you know, but it works anyway. That's the idea, because we still have an extremely well-organized city where all citizens, and that was the principle, have 10 minutes on a bike to the green area. This was the principle for it. And also easy access to the city center and so on. So we could expand the city and still maintain this green areas thing. And we never got a donut problem with the inner cities empty or anything like that because of this plan. This was an extremely robust plan that could develop because it was structured to develop towards the unknown. So this is basically my presentation. And I just wanted to quote the city manager of a city in Denmark who said, after Corona, he said, wow, we have been so robust the last 1.5 years, much more than we normally are. We have created more innovation in the Danish public sector in the last 2 years than in the previous 7 years, because we have changed the way we govern. We've become much more robust. And now it's just a matter of how do we routinize this kind of robustness, you know, the capacity to change what we're doing all the time. How can we routinize that? And that's a good way of saying exactly what I'm trying to say. So this is, yeah, thank you for, I just have a list of references, and if anybody are interested in things I've done. But thank you for listening. These were my thoughts.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you so much for sharing with us your knowledge, your experience, your vision, no? With this presentation. First of all, I have to say that if the participants have some questions, please put them at the chat group. So after that, I'm going to read it. But I have a question for you. I have a comment. I have a question. I really loved some concepts you put at your presentation. I really loved the concept of systemic resilience. No? Particularly because Latin American countries, Latin American states and governments are very used to have these kind of shocks, endogenous and exogenous. No? I have to say that we live in turbulence. It's not like Europe or the US or Canada. We live in turbulence. So my question is about the civil service, the bureaucracy, in fact. Do you think we have a roadmap to strengthen institutional robustness in Latin American countries faced to European or maybe American or maybe developed countries to this kind of things? Thank you.
That's a really good point, I think, and probably so. But you tell me if the frame of mind for both for you as researchers, but also for your public civil servants and so on, is it the same as we have in Northern Europe and in the US? I would also say this basic idea that the public sector main target is to govern the regular. I don't know if you ever had that, because that has prevented us from seeing exactly all that turbulence and seeing it as a normality. But I would say if you're civil servants and you as researchers have approached kind of turbulence as normality, we can learn a bunch from you. I would say that you don't have, please don't go our way. You have really a good point there, because we have kind of put a blind eye to the fact that the world has always been completely irregular and unpredictable, but we've just made believe that it was, and then hit all the problems that came up when things didn't work.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how to develop institutional robustness, because I think in my experience that we have in Latin America, we have a civil service resilient, because we have survived through several crises and turbulences, but we don't have developed an institutional robustness. That's kind of different, you know?
Yeah, and that's simply you have a lot of maybe personnel capacity.
Yeah.
But it is not supported by the system. So, and that happens, of course, often, and also in our countries, that you kind of, it's despite the institutions that you actually manage to do something good now and then. And this is, of course, a huge problem, because then it becomes harder if the institutions kind of become a problem for you, that you have to circumvent your institutions. Institutions should support us, actors in doing exactly that, and also helping us to do that really interesting thing, to maintain that we are actually conservative in trying to continue to do what the public sector should do in terms of values and public sector orientation and public value orientation, I would say, and so on, and collective decision making, creating effective and legitimate solutions. Right? And if you say that institutions do not support that, it's left to the personnel, you might risk that some of the responses to turbulence will actually lose the overall sight of where we're going, exactly effective and legitimate governance. So I think the institutions are always important for securing that we don't lose sight of why we have a public sector and what it is it needs to do.
Okay, I have a question of Silvio Castro. Silvio is asking, during the Corona crisis, many emergency procedures were activated. For example, in the handling of funds. How to do so that this action do not go against transparency and accountability? Yeah.
And that's also a very good question. It relates exactly to what I said to you in the end. Like, it's not about a matter of beginning to do a lot of things very quickly, because we have to make sure that it's not, kind of undermining the whole overall purpose and function and logic of what it is the public sector is trying to do. So therefore, we need to have some systemic procedures and so on that makes sure that we can respond and act quickly and innovate and find out what to do within a framework that actually is regulated to some extent and in some way, for example, with reference to accountability or transparency. Yeah,
I think that the challenge will be to have, as you said, procedures and protocols that will be accountable, because if we have an emergency and all is quick, so transparency is down. I have another question of Nicolás Ilosegui of the Patagonia. What distinctive characteristic has the average Danish people towards citizen engagement? That's a difficult question, I guess.
We are a country where we have a long tradition for citizen engagement.
Yeah, I know that.
It started, we had some very powerful trade unions, and also agriculture organizations, and also the agriculture organizations, they became involved in actually organizing dairy and all kind of productions and so on. So in associations, so we have strong associations, and we've had that for centuries. So if you look at the average state, that person would be member of 5, 6 associations, civil society association. So we have really the special thing about Denmark is that we have a very, very strong civil society, and we also have a very, very strong state. And that means that these counterpowers have produced the need to talk together, and citizen involvement is a kind of aspect of that, right? But also another aspect is a public sector that tries to be responsive and tries to listen and tries to engage to some extent. So this is why we have I would say that's one of the reasons why we have the capacity to robust action is actually that we use all those networks. We use them all the time. For example, to respond to Corona, we know how to round up the usual suspects and say, what do we do? Because the network's already there. And I think existing networks that can be mobilized, sometimes they sleep because we don't use them, but suddenly we need them. And it's networks of public and private actors. And that's why they are so forceful, because they kind of link public and private sector when it's necessary, but not all the time.
Thank you so much, Eva. I don't know if we have another question. Yes, of Luz Piraino. Do you think that in order to achieve a robust governance, it is essential to build increasingly with the private sector, or should the future governance necessarily strengthen and focus on the public sector? This is a real debate here in Latin America. No? I don't know if it's the same debate in Europe.
I think that there's been a paradigmatic shift in Europe. From the idea that the public, but it's also because we have a public sector which is really, really ambitious. And that's also because we have a public who's really demanding. They want the best of everything, right? They look at the government, and the government says, yes, 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 yes. And the politicians say, yes, yes, yes. And then they find that they cannot produce what they promised. And basically, that's the paradigm shift from where they thought that they could do it on their own, they could meet all the demands and expectations for public health and well-being, and then they found out the only way to actually, for example, help people to become healthy is to involve them. But basically, the public sector can do so much. I actually had a study showing the public sector can affect public health with 20% of the public health. 80% of how healthy people are depends on how they live their lives, right? What they put in a lunch basket, or if they run or if they don't run, right? So now everything, and it's in all areas. Okay, if we're going to really succeed here, we have to mobilize the public. So the public and the private sector has to collaborate. And we use the term co-creation to say that. We say today, public sector has to be an arena for co-creation between the public and the private. And again, we just have to, because we can imagine all that corruption and all that bad things that could come out of that if we don't regulate it. So again, we're back to, I'm saying we need to build a systemic, robust structure that can regulate all these kinds of productive interactions to avoid corruption and to avoid all the bad things that could come out of this.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing with us your vision, your experience, and your presentation. I don't know, Alejandro, if you want to say something.
No.
If not, we are done.
I think we are done. We have to thank Eva for your time, for the quality of your conference. You gave us a lot of ideas to reflect on, and I think we have learned a lot. If there is another question, I want to thank you, your presence here, and to the audience, we will say that we will share the slides from Eva in a later time with you. So Eva, thanks a lot, and I think I will invite you another time to a new webinar if you want.
Thank you so much. Let's talk about that. I thank you so much. It was a pleasure to discuss with you all, and thank you, Maximiliano, for your great comments and so on, and for hosting the whole thing here, Alessandro. So thank you so much. Hope to see you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.